Welcome to the 12th in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. This is the third episode on the Crusades and our final episode on the Crusades. Now, the rules for those of you who are uninitiated, this is not an academic presentation and I'm giving it from a secular perspective. I'm not accredited in history, religion, or any of the other disciplines that we may be talking about today. As is typical, be respectful of the material. This is going to be an interactive presentation, so please ask questions, give comments, clarifications, and other types of things. I really enjoy the interactive atmosphere. This class will be a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll bring you up to speed, and if you know something, I'll hopefully deepen the knowledge that you do know. And this will be recorded, so please feel free to watch it later or compare it with previous presentations. And without further ado, the quiz. Everybody's so excited. All right, so question number 1. Why did King Amalric of Jerusalem authorize invading Egypt?
I'd go with D.
D is interesting, but it's actually false.
That's why I usually avoid the quiz.
A?
Yeah, A, right? We talked about how there was that, you had that weak Caliph Al-Adid of the Fatimid Caliphate, and so you had the viziers fighting over power. It was first the fight between Shawar and Dirgham, and then eventually between Shawar and the Zengid emissary Shirkuh. We don't have much history of Fatimids committing horrible anti-Christian atrocities. There was discrimination, but nothing particularly egregious. Egypt was often, Egypt wasn't unnecessary as a beachhead because the Crusaders almost always had Levantine coast, so they wouldn't need another location for that. And Egypt was not likely to become a Byzantine ally. To the extent that they had relations with the Byzantines, they were positive, but they were much more concerned with the Zengids immediately because they were on their border. Okay, question number 2. Which statements accurately reflect Saladin's goals? Choose all that apply.
Well, B sounds good.
B sounds good, yeah.
Well, I guess Saladin, he didn't want the Crusaders to return, but I guess there was some brutalization, but not a whole lot. He didn't want to become a Sunni caliph. He couldn't. He was not eligible to become a caliph. So C, I think, is wrong.
Correct.
So how about E? Did he? I don't think he attacked all the Crusader state fortresses.
Okay,
I
so
think Baibars finished that project.
so basically all your intuitions are correct, right? A is wrong. Saladin didn't specifically brutalize Crusaders. B is correct, that he did want to unite all the former Zengid territories under his rule. C is incorrect, as Ralph pointed out, because he couldn't become Sunni caliph, and he respected the authority of the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad. D is true. He did attack all of the Crusader state fortresses. He wasn't successful in all of those attacks, which is why Tyre remained standing, but all of the other fortresses did fall to him. And Saladin did want to abolish the Fatimid Caliphate. In fact, that's what he did. When he was vizier for the Fatimid Caliphate, he made the caliph, he basically imprisoned the caliph and then sought legitimacy from the Abbasid Caliphate. Given that the Fatimids were Shiite, the Abbasid Caliph was willing to grant legitimacy to a Sunni monarch and granted him the title of Sultan. All right, question number 3. Which 3 of the following statements about the Treaty of Jaffa are correct?
Okay, E is definitely correct.
Yep, he is correct.
F sounds sensible.
Okay, so what's your third?
A is definitely not true. B is ultimately what happened. Whether the treaty allowed for that or not, I don't know.
And I guess the Crusaders were allowed to fortify Ascalon within limits. That sounds right.
Howard actually got the three of them, B, E, and F. No, Ascalon was razed to the ground. Saladin refused to allow the Crusaders to have that because Ascalon would be a beachhead towards attacking Egypt. And the narrow corridor along the Levantine coast was a grant by Saladin, strictly because while the Crusaders did have fortresses, they didn't have the ground. So he ceded them the contiguous territory from Jaffa in the south to Tripoli in the north. All right, question number 4. Which of the following accurately describes the reasons why Crusaders in the Fourth Crusade militarily occupied Constantinople?
Well, that would be C and D. Oh, hang on. Sorry, which one guy?
Well, one of them is
Oh,
correct.
sorry, it was D.
Correct.
Sorry. Yep.
C is correct, I think. It
Yes,
was
yes.
the collecting the debt.
Exactly
he hadn't paid the debt.
That's exactly right. So Alexius IV Komnenos made the agreement with the Crusaders that if he were put in power and his father Isaac II removed from prison, that he would pay 200,000 ducats. And he was so unpopular that he couldn't gather the funds, and so the Crusaders decided to replace him. The Venetians.
That ruled out D.
D is very similar to what happened, but Michael VIII Palaeologos was a lord in the Empire of Nicaea who conquered Constantinople from the Crusaders in 1261. Yeah, the Seljuk Sultan was at peace with the Empire of Nicaea and didn't attack Constantinople at this time. And the Venetians, although they may have wished to expel the Genoese from the city, that wasn't the motivation for the invasion. Okay, question number 5. Which statements accurately reflect how the situation of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome changed as a result of the Fourth Crusade? Choose all that apply.
You mentioned D last week, as I recall.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
A sounds good.
Okay.
B sounds sensible.
Okay.
C, were they that educated to have cared about C? That doesn't sound very good.
I think D is wrong. I think they remained relatively independent of the great Seljuk Empire in the East.
I agree.
You're all correct. It's A, B, and E. On the question of the Turkish language, the thing is that they didn't consider the Turkish language to be a literary language. So they would do politics in Turkish, they would write literature in Persian, and they would perform theology in Arabic. And they kept them relatively separate, but a lot of Persian and Arabic loanwords entered Turkish at this point. So one of the things that actually we're going to see when we go into Turkey is that Ataturk is doing something historically anomalous in the 1920s when he removes a lot of the Arabic and Persian loanwords from Turkish. And most Turks today will say that they have an easier time reading Turkish from before this period in the Seljuk Sultanate than afterwards, because this was the period when those loan words started coming into Turkish. And as we pointed out, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome continuously avoided reunion with the Great Seljuk Empire, and in fact outlasted it. We're going to talk about that more next week. Okay. So, as we remember, the Great Seljuk Empire divided into all of these different Arabeg, and so it really took the reunification efforts that occurred in order to bring the Levantine coast and Egypt together, and that was a direct result of the War of Egyptian Succession, where Saladin, by way of the Zengid emissaries, came to power in Egypt. Once he was in power in Egypt, he had declared that sultanate. He was able to unify it with the territory in the Levant region, and create the Ayyubid Sultanate, right? His family was the Ayyubid family, and so he was now in charge of this great sultanate. At the end of right before the Third Crusade, right, the Crusaders are really limited to a few towns, a few cities along the coast, because Saladin had won at the Battle of Hattin, had won Jerusalem back. And so you can see a map on the right where it's a little bit clearer. The Crusader states prior to the Third Crusade were these little rum states that were fledgling along the coast. When Richard I came and effectively fought Saladin during the First Crusade, they came to the Treaty of Jaffa, resulting in what we see on the right-hand side now, right? That coastal line between Tripoli and Jaffa. Antioch was still independent. Tripoli was separately governed from the other cities because it was the county of Tripoli. And Saladin and Richard make this Treaty of Jaffa in 1192. And now, from Richard's perspective, this was a great time for him to make the treaty because he had to go back to England to resolve a number of dynastic issues that he had there. It was also really great timing for Saladin because he died a year later. So if we look at where Saladin is coming from, his empire is now inherited by his brother, Saphadin. Saphadin being his English name. His actual name is Al-Adil, but he had a nickname, which was Saphadin, sword of the religion. And Saphadin came into English as Saphadin. So Saladin's brother was Saphadin, and while Saladin was alive, Saphadin was his war minister. And he was the one responsible for working and creating the supply lines that Saladin needed. Because remember, his base of operation was in Cairo. You can see on the map, it's in the lower left, and he keeps fighting all of these wars in the Levant region. So he had a number of emirs that he posted into Syria and cities like Homs and Damascus and Aleppo. But at the same time, he needed to be able to deal with his baggage train and other major issues. And so Saphadin really filled in that responsibility. Now, Saladin, when he died, he appointed his son, Afdal Ali, to be his successor. And Saphadin supported this choice. He defended Afdal Ali, but there were others who claimed that they could do it better, especially Al-Aziz Uthman, who was another of Saladin's children. So from 1193 until about 1200, you had these dynastic wars between the different sons, both of Saladin and of Saphadin, as to who would be the next ruler of the Ayyubid Sultanate. So the first thing was that Al-Aziz Uthman took up the charge, and from about 1193 for a few years, he fought Afdal Ali, and Saphadin finally decided that it was in his best interest to support Al-Aziz Uthman. And so Al-Aziz Uthman ruled for about 2 or 3 years, and then he died in a horse riding accident. So the remaining brothers decided to figure out what to do. And so Afdal Ali, who had not been killed, he'd just been removed from power, worked with his brother, Az-Zahir Ghazi, and the two of them fought on one side. Saphadin fought with his son Al-Kamil on the other side, and the two of them fought in Damascus in 1199, right? Damascus was Az-Zahir Ghazi's home territory, but Saphadin, because of his military expertise, having worked with his brother for all those years, was able to defeat him in Damascus and quickly ran to Bilbais, which is in Egypt. You can see on the map. He quickly ran there and he defeated Afdal Ali's final troops there, securing for himself the rule of the entire Ayyubid Sultanate. And his son Al-Kamil, for having been loyal to him, was made chief vizier of the Ayyubid Sultanate under him. As far as we can tell, as long as Saphadin was alive, which was until 1218, he was a very competent ruler of the Ayyubid Sultanate. There were a number of different reforms that he instituted while he was in power. The first one is that he refortified the Damascus citadel. As I mentioned, Saphadin had defeated Afdal Ali and Az-Zahir Ghazi in Damascus. So the city had been relatively razed to the ground as a result of the conflict, but he was very interested in making sure that all the fortresses and fortifications, especially in the Levant region, would be strong enough to resist resist Crusader attacks and attacks from in the east. Now, he also seemed to have made a number of great economic reforms. And we've seen this in that Egypt's economy boomed even after all the expenses that had to be paid for Saladin's conquering wars. We also know that Egypt suffered an overflow of the Nile, which led to a massive flood in the country. In the early 1200s, there was also an earthquake in the same time, and yet the government was able to pay and recover from these incidents. So we know that Saphadin really managed a functioning economy. In terms of the Crusaders, Saphadin actually tried to create a peaceful situation with them. Remember, Saladin had a truce that was only for 3 years at the Treaty of Jaffa. So Saphadin actually worked to extend that. And while there were some raids and skirmishes, generally speaking, under his rule, there were no major Crusader attacks on any Ayyubid holdings. At the same time, there were some raids from the European side. Damietta and Rosetta, the one from the Rosetta Stone, were coastal towns in Egypt that were raided. I think Rosetta was raided in 1207 and Damietta in 1205, but don't quote me on that. But those raids were few and far between. Saphadin sent emissaries to Europe and tried to maintain peaceful relations. So this really is the start of the Ayyubid Sultanate, and so far it seems to be going very well. Saphadin appoints a number of his children, especially Al-Muazzam Isa, to be leaders on the Levantine side, right? Al-Kamil is based in Cairo and is the vizier in Cairo. Al-Muazzam Isa, for example, was given the city of Damascus, and other Ayyubid princes were given other cities, which to make their own minor emirates within the larger Ayyubid Sultanate. Now, on the Christian side, we have Pope Innocent III, and if we remember him from before, it's because he authorized the indulgences in Spain and the Spanish reconquest against the Almohads, and also that he authorized the Fourth Crusade, right, where the Venetians went out and ended up destroying Constantinople. Now, in 1213, he put out what was called the Quia Maior, which was a papal bull that set up a new crusade. He wanted to go crusading again. And we note some interesting things about the Quia Maior. The first one is that it held that anybody who was fighting in the Albigensian Crusade in the south of France or against the Almohads in Spain could continue to do that, and they would fulfill their requirement for indulgences. But anybody else who wanted to acquire these indulgences, anybody who wanted to do their duty as a Christian, would have to be involved in the Fifth Crusade. The next interesting thing is that it had become standard practice at this point to see Egypt and taking Egypt as the fundamental way to gain territory in the Holy Land. When Richard I, if we remember, was in Jaffa, and he wanted to take the city of Ascalon, and then from Ascalon launch an invasion of Egypt, the majority of the crusading knights were opposed to this. But by the time we got to the Fourth Crusade, the Venetians from Constantinople were supposed to go to Egypt. That never happened, of course, because they took the city of Constantinople instead. They sacked it. But by the time of the Fifth Crusade, it was very clear that Egypt was an acceptable destination for the crusade. And another thing that's interesting about the Quia Maior is that Pope Innocent III said that any of the Venetians who, of course, had not fulfilled their crusading oaths because they sacked the city of Constantinople, which was a Christian city, if they wished to fulfill their oaths, they could go on the Fifth Crusade. And finally, Pope Innocent III ordered a boycott of all Muslim products and all Muslim empires. Now, this isn't completely enforced, and some Muslim states continue to have trade with European states, but the Quia Maior holds that that should be the case. On the right-hand side, you can see Pope Innocent III in front of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, making the case again for a Fifth Crusade. So now we have the Christian leadership of the Fifth Crusade, and it's a little complex, and it's very problematic in terms of organization. So probably our most important individual is Frederick II Hohenstaufen of the Holy Roman Empire, right? He gets crowned later, but he is originally king of Sicily, and he comes to be elected to the position of Holy Roman Emperor. And he took up the cross in 1215 after the Fourth Lateran Council, and he just was not interested in going. So he kept delaying and kept delaying. He even told, but the problem is that he told a lot of his emissaries and a lot of the Holy Roman troops that were sent that they should not make any agreements with the Ayyubids until he shows up in person. And the thing is that through the entirety of the crusade, he never did. There were many leaders from Europe who had less standing, who did go, like Andrew II of Hungary or Leopold VI, Duke of Austria. But Andrew II of Hungary didn't even make it to Egypt. He got on the boats and just pretty much turned around. Leopold VI got there, but didn't really make much of an impact because as a duke, he wasn't as respected. So the two people who ended up really leading the crusade are the people on the right-hand side. You had Pelagius Galvani, who was the papal emissary, and John of Brienne, who was the king of Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem wasn't a territory that he controlled. And there would be a lot of enmity between Pelagius and John of Brienne over what the authority should be. Since John of Brienne was the only monarch in Egypt when the majority of the forces landed, he generally got control. On the Muslim side, there was also a crisis in leadership. So when Saphadin died, right, he had appointed Al-Kamil his vizier in Egypt, and he'd appointed Al-Muazzam Isa his vizier in Damascus. And when he died, those two sons basically took more direct control of their territories. So while they didn't declare independent sultanates, they were more or less separate entities. And there were incidents where one brother would help the other, but like, for example, there was an assassination attempt against Al-Kamil, where Al-Muazzam Isa sent soldiers to protect him. But generally speaking, Al-Kamil and Al-Muazzam Isa were very much at odds with one another. So when the Crusaders arrived, he was not in the position really to he was in a position to oppose them, but he didn't see them as the more serious threat. In fact, as I pointed out, right, there was an assassination attempt against him by the Mamluk, by the soldiers that they had bought and hired. You can see a Mamluk in the upper right-hand side. These were horse nomads from Central Asia, primarily. They had tried to install Faiz Ibrahim, who was Al-Kamil's younger brother, and who was much more pliable to the Ayyubid throne, in order to control the throne through him. And it didn't work. Now, when the Crusaders arrived, Al-Kamil actually addressed them directly before they besieged Damietta, and said that he actually wanted to discuss terms with them. He was willing to give them the city of Jerusalem, a number of the Crusader fortresses in the Holy Land, and he would return to them the True Cross. Now, whether or not he actually had the True Cross is a serious question and contention. We know that Saladin took it from the Christians at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. So it's entirely possible that Al-Kamil could have had it, but most historians believe that he did not have it. Regardless, John of Brienne wanted to take these offers, the expansion of Jerusalem, the reacquisition of these castles. These would all be really helpful things, but Pelagius refused to allow it. And at the same time, many of the Crusaders also, many of the other Crusaders also refused to accept it, because Frederick II Hohenstaufen had told them to wait for him before accepting any treaty. So unfortunately, Al-Kamil's view was rescinded, and the Fifth Crusade began in earnest. So the city of Damietta, that port city in Egypt, was besieged. We remember the siege of Damietta before, during the War of Egyptian Succession. Same idea, but this time the siege takes over a year. And unfortunately, many Franks die in the attempt to take the fortress. Also, when they conquered it, they noticed the Egyptians who were defending it had very few resources. Now, again, once they had taken the city, Al-Kamil offered terms again. But by the time that they had taken the city, John of Brienne was actually not in Egypt anymore. And so it was Pelagius who made all of the decisions, which was not necessarily the best strategic interest. Now, as an aside, the reason why John of Brienne was not in Egypt was that through marriage he had inherited the title of the king of Armenian Cilicia. So, because of that, he wanted to claim the title. So in March of 1220, he left. He was not able to claim the title for a lot of internal Armenian reasons, and was only able to come back when he had enough money in July of 1221. In that year-long period, Pelagius had made a mess of things, diplomatically speaking, even though Damietta was firmly in Crusader hands. He decided to march further south into the Nile Delta to the city of Mansoura, which had a large fortress, a large Ayyubid fortress. And at that point, Al-Kamil decided to open up the sluice gates, which existed at numerous points in the Nile Delta, which let the flood river come through and wiped out a significant portion of the Crusaders. And at that point, the Crusaders had to ask for terms. Pelagius gave up Damietta and all Egyptian territory in return for safe passage out of the country, and the return of the true cross, which was not actually returned. So the Fifth Crusade was seen largely negatively, and it had a couple consequences. The first one was that the secular leaders would no longer allow a papal legate to join them. And the next one was that, by and large, Crusaders would try to make a better go of it in Egypt. Okay, so we should talk a little bit about Frederick II Hohenstaufen. So we mentioned that he was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 1220. He was crowned, and he actually grew up in Sicily. So he spoke Arabic and had a relationship with Al-Kamil. Now, that relationship in his later years would be so strong that they would exchange gifts. Al-Kamil gave him a giraffe, and he gave Al-Kamil a polar bear. Not necessarily the best thing to send to Egypt, but that was part of their friendship. He was also interested in the sciences and other discoveries that had been made in the Arab world. That's not to say that he was not a staunch Christian or that he was a rationalist. He was very much a person who persecuted heresies and heretics, but he was not of the view that Muslims should not be talked to and that there should be no relationship at all. By 1225, he had promised to go on crusade so many times and delayed it so many times to deal with the internecine struggles of his Holy Roman Empire in Europe that Pope Innocent IV basically told him that he had a deadline. And so he said, okay, by the end of 1227, I will go to Jerusalem. I will go to the Holy Land and crusade. And so at the end of 1227, he got himself on a boat and he started on his way, but he got sick. And so he turned around and came back to Italy to recover a little bit. He was preparing to head out in 1228, and he asked the Pope for some leniency. And the Pope said, no, you were supposed to crusade by the end of 1227. You haven't crusaded, and therefore you are going to be excommunicated. You clearly have not fulfilled your vows. And so Hohenstaufen said, "What can I do to end the excommunication?" And the Papal States said very simply, "You can give us the Kingdom of Sicily. And at that point, we will release your excommunication." Frederick II Hohenstaufen thought that was, well, sorry, I forgot the word.
Extortionate.
There we go. That it was extortionate. Thank you. Yeah, so he thought that it was extortion and that there's absolutely no reason why you should give up the Holy Roman Empire. And he was going to go to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as was his right. So he arrives there in 1228, but there had already been waves of crusaders arriving in Acre and Tyre before that in 1227. So he arrives and he starts to galvanize troops together. Now, of course, it's known in the territory that he is excommunicated, and he's wildly unpopular because he's been excommunicated. Additionally, because he married the daughter of John of Brienne, he had inherited the title King of Jerusalem. So he was technically the king of a territory he had never stepped foot in before. And that also alienated many of the people. Regardless, he started building fortifications in Jaffa. And at that point, there was a speech made by Sultan al-Kamil. And he said, "We need to stop the possibility of war. We need to come to some sort of agreement." And King Frederick II, about a month later, gave a speech in response, saying that no, we don't want a tragic war at all either. We want to come to some amicable resolution. And so the two kings met, and they discussed terms. And Sultan al-Kamil decided that, generally speaking, he wanted a better situation with the Crusader states anyway. Up until 1227, Al-Mu'azzam, Al-Mu'azzam Isa had been a threat to him, but Al-Mu'azzam Isa had died in 1227. Nevertheless, he was always afraid that a new emir would come to power in the eastern part and use power against him. So he wanted the Crusader states to act more as a buffer. He gave them the area around Jerusalem, around Bethlehem, and he signed a 10-year truce with the Crusaders, which were incredibly gracious terms. However, since and you can see the area that he ceded to them in the blue. However, the Latin patriarchs still considered him in excommunication, that he was not a true Catholic, and so they gave interdiction. Now, this is not a picture of Gerald of Lausanne. This is the picture of the current Latin patriarch, but the dress would have been the same for Gerald of Lausanne, and he forbade any religious services from occurring in the parts of Jerusalem that had been ceded, because the Dome of the Rock and some other places with large Muslim populations were not ceded, but the majority of Jerusalem was, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So my sort of question to everybody else is, why do you think that the Ayyubids saw their own family as being worse than the Franks?
Is that their own family or just their fellow Muslims?
No, Mu'azzam is the brother of Al-Kamil.
Oh, okay.
And the Ayyubid sultans always, their biggest worry was other Ayyubid claimants to the throne.
Okay, there's lots of monarchical systems where a change of power consists of some family member murdering all the other family members. Were the Turks good at political stability?
Yeah, no, this is that's actually one of the key things, is that many of the brothers were either killed or imprisoned or jailed or whatever, because they tried to take the sultanate for themselves. And so the Crusader states were less of a direct threat, but they could endanger one of the leaders in the Ayyubid Sultanate, and therefore throw off this balance of power that they created. And sort of a question that I have on the Christian side, why were the Christians so opposed to accept Frederick II's victory over Jerusalem?
Well, I would assume it because Holy Roman politics were more important than capturing Jerusalem, probably. This is Pope Innocent III still, isn't it?
Sorry?
Is this still Pope Innocent III?
This is Pope Innocent IV now.
It's a newer pope. Look, Innocent III was an absolute control freak.
Yeah. No, Innocent
Um,
III died in 1216.
But I don't know much about Innocent IV. Still, it's
Also,
there was Go ahead.
Jerusalem was pretty much indefensible. The Crusaders could control the strip along the Mediterranean, but Jerusalem was some distance inland, and it was very hard to maintain that route open.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. One of the main arguments that the Crusaders made was that the area around Jerusalem was not that Al-Qamin had given them was not sufficient to actually defend it.
But that's true no matter how they take it.
Yeah. No, I always find it strange that Frederick II actually got Jerusalem back, and yet he's looked on less favorably than other crusading kings who did not get Jerusalem back. If only because he did it through diplomatic means, and he did it while being reviled in the kingdom of Jerusalem, because he was a king who hadn't put any sweat equity really into building the kingdom.
Well, the other interpretation I've seen, he didn't slaughter any Muslims.
Yeah, that too.
And by the sounds of it, he's supposed to hand Sicily over to the Pope. So the Pope's got lots of reason to be pissed off at him.
Yeah.
I think, but it's not in both cases. It's a case of rulers dealing with local politics rather than foreign. Taking local politics takes precedence over foreign politics.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Frederick II is actually pelted with dung as he leaves Jerusalem in the kingdom of Jerusalem in 1229, and of course he never returns. So as soon as he leaves, you would think that a period of a 10-year truce would be a period when the Crusaders would come together and create a defensive position. That's absolutely not what happens. One of the things that Frederick II had tried to do was to strip John of Ibelin of his property. Now, John of Ibelin was the son of Balian of Ibelin, who was the one who gave Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187, who surrendered the city. So they were historically from the city of Jerusalem, but they moved to Beirut after the city was lost. And Frederick II decided to deprive him of his lands. John of Ibelin rejected this, said that under the agreements that had existed in the Crusader states, only a full group of the Crusader knights and lords could come together and strip any lord of his territory, which was actually true. But Frederick II didn't feel that he was required to follow these rules. And so he sent Marshal Riccardo Filangieri, as you can see on the right-hand side, to the Crusader states to bring them into line. And so you now had a civil war called the War of the Lombards, which brewed in the Crusader states. And the Lord John of Ibelin got together most of the other lords of the kingdom of Jerusalem. He also got the Templar Order and Genoese shipping to get on his side. King Frederick Hohenstaufen got the Teutonic Hospitaliers on his side, as well as Bohemond V of Antioch and Tripoli. He was ruling both territories at the time, and the Pisans. And so you had this massive civil war, where the Hohenstaufen side was primarily people from outside of the territory, and the Ibelin side was mostly people in the territory. Eventually, the Marshal began to lose territory, and he holed up in the fortress in Tyre. Eventually, Tyre was breached, and he had to escape. But the reason Tyre was breached is that the actual people in Tyre preferred the lords of Jerusalem over Frederick's sent man, and Alice of Champagne Anas of Champagne, who took power as the regent of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, ordered basically took back control for Jerusalem from Conrad, who was the son of Frederick II, and re-centralized control in the Crusader state. It would remain independent of the Holy Roman Empire from that point forward. Now,
I'm sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
Who were the Lombards?
Sure. The term Lombard refers to a number of the ancestries of the dynasties that these lords had come from. Nobody really here was actually born in Lombardy.
Okay. Lombardy being
Lombardy's a region in northwestern Italy.
Territory in Italy. Well, what's now Italy?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So one of the things that we should mention is that a lot of what we've been talking about has been happening in the shadow of the Mongol conquest. And we're going to talk more about that in 2 weeks. But what's really important to understand is that the Mongols were pushing against two different entities in this period in the 1220s and into the 1240s, right? As we move from the 1220s, 1230s, 1240s, the Mongols are pushing on Khwarezm, which is the dominant Persian Empire, and is pushing into Cumania, or the state of the Kipchaks, which is in what's now Western Kazakhstan, into Russia, into Ukraine, a very sparsely populated area. Now, the Kipchaks and the Khwarezmians, and the Khwarezmians being the people who governed Khwarezm, were both mobile horse archers. We're going to talk more about the Khwarezmians next week. But suffice it to say that the pressure from the Mongols is pushing them westward, and the Kipchaks, many of them are being captured and sold as slaves, both by Mongols and by fellow Kipchak tribesmen, and by the Kingdom of Hungary, which they tried to flee to and warn them about, Genghis Khan. But as a result, you start having significantly more Mamluks on the market, right? Mamluk being these slave soldiers that you can purchase, than was previously normal, right? The Khwarezmians didn't become Mamluks, they stayed independent, but in many cases they became roving bands of horse archers, entirely separated from the power that they'd once held. And so you have the son of Ad Kamil taking power in 1240. His father died in 1238. There was a brief interregnum, but in 1240 he managed to get power. His power base was actually in Damascus, and he then made his way to Cairo. Once in Cairo, he assassinated all of the leadership that had pertained to his brother Ali II, who he assassinated. But after that point, he became extremely paranoid and bought 1,000 Mamluks, which was unheard of previously, in order to defend himself. And these Mamluks, made of Kipchaks, were now established as a secondary class in Egypt because they were now so numerous, right? Previously, there were a few hundred of them. It wasn't that big of a deal. Now there were many more. And Salih Ayub also made relations with the Khwarezmians, who had invaded from the eastern side into what's now eastern Syria, northwestern Iraq. And those were territories, as long as they were on the west bank of the Euphrates, those were territories within the Ayyubid Sultanate. But the Khwarezmians were allowed to live there as long as they fought on the side of the Sultan. This led to the Khwarezmians in 1244 sacking the city of Jerusalem and bringing it back under Muslim control. But they completely destroyed the city. It would have to be rebuilt once the Ayyubids got more control of it. And then just after that, in an area very close to Gaza called La Forbi, there was a major cataclysm where Salah Ayyub with his Mamluk soldiers, his Egyptian soldiers, and these Khwarezmian raiders came together against the entire Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem and a number of other Ayyubid pretenders to the throne and their forces. The Battle of La Fourbi destroyed the Crusader states. They never had anywhere near the amount of knights that they had assembled at this battle in the entire future of the Crusades, and about half of their leading generals and significant numbers of knights were lost. They would never be able to launch an offensive campaign ever again. And additionally, the Khwarezmians had routed all of the pretenders to Salah Ayyub, so Salah remained in power as the Ayyubid Sultan until he died in 1249. So we start to move towards the end of Salah's reign. And at that point, you have the Seventh Crusade. Now, the Seventh Crusade is started by King Louis IX of France. He's seen as incredibly pious, and he starts planning as early as 1244, right? He sees that sack of Jerusalem, the Battle of La Fourbi, and both of these things. And he decides that a crusade needs to happen to defend the Holy Land. He sets one up for Damietta that will head out in 1248. They arrive there in 1249. Now, you remember the last time they came to Damietta, this Egyptian port city, it took over a year for them to besiege the fortress and then make their way inland. In this case, Damietta falls within a week. So it's actually very easy for them to take control. And from that point, they start marching south to Mansoura, which is this fortress. If it feels like deja vu, it probably is, because we've seen this before. And while heading to Mansoura, they try to find a way to ford the prong of the Nile that they're by and take the Mamluk fortress by surprise. Robert I, Count of Artois, finds an Egyptian trader who's willing to tell him where the river can be forded. And Robert I, instead of listening to King Louis IX, doesn't wait until a sizable beachhead is made on the far side of the river before attacking. He attacks immediately. He takes the commander by surprise and then invades the city of Mansoura. Now, the force that he has is not large enough to actually conquer the city, and the city has a lot of winding passageways. So the Battle of Mansoura becomes this confused, labyrinthine issue. And the Mamluk who was leading the defense of the city, his name was Baibars, decides that he's going to close the gates of the city, and now the inferior numbers of the Franks and their disorientation will lead to their downfall. And that's exactly what happens. Robert I is killed. Almost all the knights that entered Mansoura did not come out. Only 5 did. And then the Egyptians were on the offensive. King Louis IX was retreating. At several points, he tried to make agreements, and those agreements and the Ayyubids were not interested in honoring those agreements. And eventually, after the Battle of Fariscourt, King Louis IX of France was actually captured. This is the only time that this ever happens in the Crusades, that one of the actual leaders of a European nation is captured by the enemy. And he is actually ransomed for 500,000 livres tournois. And this is roughly half of the entire annual income of the French government at that time. So it's an incredibly high price to pay for his freedom. Now, on the Islamic side, there's actually a lot going on. This is, as I mentioned, Salah Ayyub dies in 1249. But at this time, his soldiers were busy fighting in the Crusade. So in order to prevent the Egyptian troops from being disloyal or otherwise causing problems, his now widow, Shajara Dur, you can see her on the right-hand side, or a representation of her. She took power in her own hands as Sultana, and she ruled for 80 days. But she noticed that the son of Asad Ayyub, who was based in Damascus, Turan Shah, was going to come from Damascus to Cairo and take power. Now, Turan Shah was Asad Ayyub's choice for successor, but Shajara Dur had a son of her own that she wanted to succeed him. In order to prevent him from coming to power, she made an alliance with the elite corps of the Mamluk, who did not like Turan Shah, especially since Turan Shah had his own Mamluk that were based with him in Damascus, and the Mamluk in Egypt, like Baibars, like Aybak, they all knew that if Turan Shah came to power, their roles would be minimized. So Aybak, one of the Mamluk leaders, decided to marry Shajara Dur and become the first Mamluk Sultan. Now, the Abbasid Caliphate based in Baghdad refused to recognize this as legitimate, that you would usurp power from the legitimate Ayyubid family, and so his rule was not recognized, and he had to at least pretend that an Ayyubid Sultan was in power. So he appointed a little boy for whom he could be the regent. And this situation actually got them through the Crusade. Shajara Dur and Izzeddin Aybak worked together to expel the French, collect that reward, and then, like all good things, Aybak decided that he wanted a second wife, and that he wanted to marry one of the emiras, one of the princesses of Damascus, in order to cement his control over both Egypt and Damascus. Shajara Dur did not take kindly to the idea that she would be one wife out of many, and so she found him in the bath and stabbed him to death. Izzeddin Aybak's son, who was 15 at the time, then effectively took control and ordered some of the servants to rip off Shajara Dur's clothes so she was stark naked, beat her with clogs, and throw her out of the window into a moat. So both of these leaders ended up dying, and that 15-year-old boy in 1257 became the second Ayyubid Sultan, the second Mamluk Sultan. By that point, Izzeddin Aybak had managed to secure the legitimacy of the Mamluk Sultanate, or at least the functional legitimacy of the Mamluk Sultanate, by making agreements with Baghdad concerning some of the Ayyubid royals. So now we have a complete change in government, right? So the Ayyubids are now no longer in power. These Mamluk, these slave soldiers, have revolted and are now ruling the country. So during the same period that Aybak is consolidating his power, the Crusader states are getting weaker. You have the War of St. Sabas, which pits numerous Crusader states against each other in what is effectively a proxy war between Venice and Genoa. One of the things that ends up happening, which is a mistake, is that the Pope authorizes both Venice and Genoa to occupy the same piece of territory, and so they decide to fight it out and get all of the lords involved in fighting with each other to take it down. The next major issue that the Crusader states are facing is that a lot of the lords are seeing the writing on the wall that the Crusader states are not going to last, and so they start selling their territories to the Knights Hospitalier, or Knights Templar, and the Teutonic Order. These military orders of knights start to acquire more and more land, and they can pay for it using their land holdings in Europe. So a lot of these nobles are going back, and the few nobles that remain are less and less able to control the militant orders and create a sense of balance. Finally, the Mongols are coming more and more out of the shadows. So far, they were in Central Asia, but now that the Mongols are advancing on on the Khwarezmians and on other Muslim enemies of the Crusader states, they're sending emissaries to create alliances with the Crusader states. And in fact, we see them make a successful alliance with Cilicia and Armenia and with Antioch. And that alliance will come to the fore when the Mongols lead a conquest of Syria. And we're going to see this from the Mongol perspective a little bit more in depth when we meet in 2 weeks. But from the Mamluk perspective, this was all very troubling. In 1259, after that boy had ruled for about 2 years, one of the key Mamluk generals, Qutuz, convenes an entire council of Mamluks, and they decide that that young boy at only 17 years of age is not the kind of leader that the Mamluk Sultanate needs when being invaded by something that is so massive, so incomprehensibly huge, that it's going to take everything in a leader's retinue to stop it. So Qutuz is chosen to be the new sultan, and that's just in time for the attack on Damascus. So the Mongols attack Damascus. Sorry, the Mongols first attack Aleppo in late 1259, early 1260, and you can see an image of what it would look like when the Crusaders from Antioch and the Armenians from Little Armenia joined the Mongols in attacking. Now the Mongols were attacking with nearly 100,000 soldiers. So it's no wonder that Aleppo fell. They continued down towards Egypt, taking Baalbek and Damascus in March, and then Ajlun a little bit after that, and their press was towards Egypt. They sent a letter to Qutuz demanding his surrender, and he refused to comply. Now, one of the interesting things that happens in 1260 is
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I have a quick question.
No, absolutely.
Regarding the Mongols, when they come to Damascus, and you just said they had a large army of 100,000. So is it referring to the fact that they're outnumbered? That's why they fail? Or
that's why you mean the Mamluks failed to defend Aleppo?
Yeah.
That's part of it. The Mongols,
Okay.
I mean, the thing about the Mongols, and we're going to discuss this in 2 weeks when we really go in depth about the Mongols and their fighting strategy and the rest of it, is that the Mongols had at their disposal technologies from all across Asia, right? They had technologies from China, from the Middle East, from Central Asia, and they brought all of that to bear along with their vastly superior numbers against Aleppo.
I see. Mhm.
And so while the city had strong walls, the Mongols brought them down.
Wow. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So the Mamluks had one really fortuitous bit of luck in 1260, which was that Munkeh Khan, who was the leader of the Mongol Empire, died. And the one Achilles heel of the Mongol Empire was that every time a leader died, you had to have a Kurultai, which was a council, an election, to determine who would be the next Mongol leader. And so Hülagü, who was Munkeh's brother and who had been leading the Mongol attacks in the Middle East, had to go to this Kurultai to determine who would be Munkeh's successor. So he took the majority of his troops with him. Now there is a debate as to whether he would have had to take the troops to Azerbaijan anyway, to northwestern Iran and Azerbaijan anyway, because there isn't enough grass to feed all the horses in the lower areas of the Levant. But regardless, because Hülagü had to go that much further east, all the way to Mongolia, only 20,000 Mongols remained in the area of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, right? And they were under the Nestorian Christian Kitbuka. Now, an army of 20,000 was something that the Mamluks could at least fight. And so Baibars, that same Mamluk who had led the Battle of Mansoura, right? That one that had locked all the Crusaders in and killed them, this very sort of devious way of fighting. He was the one charged by Qutuz to go to head off the Mongol force. At this time, the Mamluks also reached out to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, we remember that Antioch was a Mongol vassal state, but the Kingdom of Jerusalem had not decided which way it would go. And so they signaled to the Mamluks that while they wouldn't ally with them, because the Mamluks had asked them for an alliance as well, because the Mamluks saw that the Mongols were worse than anything the Crusaders could throw at them. The Crusaders decided not to give the Mamluks an alliance, but they did allow them to pass through their territory, which allowed them to catch the Mongols by surprise at Ain Jalut. And what's interesting here in terms of tactics is that the Mamluks actually used pretty much the same kind of tactics that the Mongols typically used in order to defeat the Mongols. Typically, the way that Mongols attack is that they send their most mobile horse archers into the enemy fray. So the enemy has the wrong idea about the size of the Mongol force, has the wrong idea about the disposition of the Mongol force. And after they have gotten the enemy to give chase, they will return back to the main line and attack and attack the now on the offensive enemy with fresh troops that came from behind. And Baibars did exactly this in reverse. He lured Kipchaks into an area where there were more Mamluks waiting, and then the front Mamluk line just crushed through the Mongol line, and Kipchaks was executed along with the large, with about half of his, no, sorry, Kipchaks made it out, but with only half of his 20,000 soldiers. He made it out with 10,000 soldiers, and he retreated, waiting for Hulagu Khan to come back after the next Khan had been elected. And you can sort of see from the picture that there isn't actually much difference in terms of the Mongol horse riders and the Mamluk horse riders. They're both wearing very light armor. They're using swords and swords and small shields in order to protect themselves. They're really fighting in much the same way. And you have to remember that most of these Mamluks are Kipchak Turks, right? They're from Central Asia. So they're familiar with this fighting style, which makes them uniquely suited to fighting the Mongols, whereas other groups might be more confused by this style. Yeah.
And Baibars actually was a Georgian descent, which is interesting.
No, Baibars was he was from the Baltia tribe. It was a Kipchak tribe.
Somehow I was reading it was converted.
There are Mamluks of Georgian descent. It's just that Baibars isn't one of them. Yeah. Probably the most famous Mamluks of Georgian descent are the ones who rule Iraq in the 1700s. Just to give us sort of a check of where we are in time, right? This 1260 was the Battle of Ain Jalut. 1261 was when Michael VIII Palaiologos reunified the Byzantine Empire by taking Constantinople from the Latins, right? So that's what's been going on in Anatolia a little bit. Now, Sultan Baibars rules for about 17 years, and he has a lot of accolades that are worth talking about in terms of how he really redefined the Mamluk situation. So the first thing that he did was that he built the first thing that he did is that he wanted to gain full-term legitimacy for the Mamluk Sultanate. Now, when Hulagu was invading the Middle East, that Mongol leader, while he was invading through the Middle East, he conquered Baghdad and overthrew the Abbasid Caliphate. So there was no leader of the Sunni Islamic world. What Baibars did is that he actually sought out the last Abbasid person, the only person from the dynasty who could be seen as a caliph, and brought him to Cairo. And this person became Al-Hakim I. And because now the Abbasid Caliphate was based in Cairo, it gave the Mamluks a strong degree of legitimacy. It wasn't as powerful as the Abbasid Caliphate had been in Baghdad, especially because the connection that Al-Hakim had to the Caliphate was very, very distant and largely difficult to prove. But it gave the Mamluk dynasty the actual power to rule and the right to rule. In that same vein, Sultan Baibars was a very religious person and wanted to build numerous mosques. In fact, he built not only massive mosques throughout the empire. You can see Baibars Mosque in Cairo, Egypt, that still stands today. He also developed Islamic schools, and there were 4 schools of Sunni jurisprudence or fiqh that existed. He had qadis or Islamic judges of all 4 schools, and he created centers for all 4 schools in his empire. He was known to pray very often, and whether or not people consider the way he fought and dealt with people to be Islamic today, his contemporaries definitely saw him as pious, and he himself considered himself pious. He was also a master builder. He built numerous bridges, roads, in order to keep Egypt connected with the Levant region. Many of his bridges still survive to this day. This is one in particular. This is the Baibars Bridge that exists in Lod. It's now in this. Lod is a city in Israel today, and you can see in the upper right-hand side of the bridge there is a lion pushing down on what looks like a plant. The lion is the symbol of Mamluk power crushing the plant, which is the Crusader states, right? Because Baibars, his intent was to conquer the Crusader states, and that's what he spent the rest of his career doing. In 1265, he attacked the Crusader fortress of Arsuf, which was an incredibly difficult fortress. The Crusaders considered it impregnable. But the massive difference in manpower between the Mamluks and the Crusader states meant that the Crusader states really could not effectively hold the fortress. They only had 250 knights there against thousands raised by Sultan Baibars. And once they had taken the fortress, they razed it. And so you can see what's left of it today. Those knights who surrendered in the citadel to Baibars were all executed, even though he had promised them clemency. After Arsuf fell in 1265, right after the Templars surrendered, Baibars had them all executed. He then took the fortress of Saphad in 1266, and similarly, when the garrison surrendered, he killed them all as well. So you can see he generally has a trend of not letting anybody get out, and this stiffened resistance to him, but that did not matter. He was a very skilled general, and in 1268 he went after Antioch, right? And Antioch called upon the Mongols to help defend them, but the Mongols had already divided into different khanates, and the Il Khan, the Khan who was responsible for the Middle East, was at war with the Khan of the Golden Horde. And so he couldn't really help, which led to Antioch being overrun by Baibars. The second Crusader state to be created was the second to fall. So in 1268, the Crusader state of Antioch was no more, and Baibars kept consolidating by taking more and more territories that have belonged to the Crusader states. So one of the things that I sort of mentioned a minute ago is that the Mongol states had divided, right? So if you look on this map, you can see the Golden Horde, the White Horde, the Chagatai, and the Ilkhan. These are all Mongol states, but in 1260 they had broken up, and the Mamluks were very instrumental in taking advantage of this, especially since the survival of the Mamluk Sultanate would require the buying of more Mamluks, buying more of these slave soldiers to create their army. And since the majority of Mamluks were coming from areas controlled by the Golden Horde, they managed to create a very good alliance with them. It didn't hurt matters, of course, that the man with whom they negotiated, his name was Noyan, was himself Muslim, whereas the Ilkhans were not Muslim, despite the fact that they controlled most of the Middle East. And so the alliance between the Golden Horde and the Mamluks effectively protected the Mamluks against the Ilkhan for the majority of their time. Now, at the same time, the Ilkhan did make incursions into the Mamluk Sultanate, but the Ilkhan didn't have the forces of the entire Mongol Empire, and the Ilkhan, as I said, was fighting the Golden Horde. So the amount that they could actually throw at the Mamluks was much less than they otherwise would have been able to. The Mamluks also managed to have stable relations with a number of European monarchies. We have cases of gifts being given between Castile, Aragon, and the Mamluk Sultanate. We also have attempts by the Mamluks to reach out to France and to Byzantium in order to create embassies there. Now we get to the Eighth Crusade. So after the fall of Antioch, there was a swell in Europe. A crusade needed to happen again. And so King Louis IX, the leader of that failed Eighth Crusade to Egypt, decides to make a new crusade, and he goes to Tunis. Does anybody have any ideas why he might want to attack Tunis? Yeah, I'm about as clueless as everybody else. Most historians guess that it has to do with the fact that his brother, Charles I of Anjou, was crowned king of Sicily, and that it was seen as a way to help him take control of North Africa and secure the position of Sicily. Perhaps it was that this way they could have a beachhead and attack the Egyptians overland and avoid the Nile Delta. There are also questions about whether or not there was some other motive, like, for example, Caliph Muhammad al-Mustansir, who was the ruler of the Hafsid dynasty, which was ruling in Tunisia. He had been more friendly to Christians than other Muslim monarchs had been, and so perhaps he was on the verge of converting. There were rumors about this. As far as we can tell from the Tunisian side, that's not the case at all. In fact, al-Mustansir had taken advantage of the fact that the Abbasid Caliphate had been overthrown to declare himself Caliph as well. He was not interested at all in converting to Christianity. Now, when the Crusaders got to Tunis, the crusade did not last long. Within a few weeks, half the group got dysentery, including Louis IX, who died in Tunis. But regardless of that, Muhammad al-Mustansir was willing to make an agreement with the Crusaders in order for them to vacate Tunisia and leave him in peace. And among those agreements was permission for Christians to openly preach in the Hafsid Caliphate. And they would have embassies of their own that would be protected, where they could study and learn Christianity. And al-Mustansir would declare himself a vassal of the Kingdom of Sicily and pay periodic tribute payments to Sicily. So it was seen as a partial success, despite the fact that the Crusaders got nowhere near Jerusalem and barely achieved any of their unstated objectives.
Richard, this may be slightly off topic, but were there any conversions between the Crusaders and the Muslims?
There were certainly Muslims who converted. We know, not in the Eighth Crusade. I'm not aware of any in the Eighth Crusade. There may be cases in Tunisia after the Eighth Crusade that Tunisians were converted, but by and large, it doesn't really seem to have survived in the historical record. In terms of the Crusader state of Jerusalem, we have numerous cases of Muslims converting. The most common case was, as we discussed last week, is the Turcopoles, right? You have those Turkish cavalry that served
Right.
in Crusader armies, and most of them either were Christian or converted to Christianity.
Okay, thanks.
So after the Eighth Crusade, Lord Edward, who had gone on the Eighth Crusade with King Louis, decided to leave Tunisia and actually go to Acre. And so he started to try and negotiate with Abaga Khan, who was the first Il Khan, the son of Hülagü. And the two of them would try to make a pincer movement against the Mamluk Sultanate. And you can see Abaga Khan on the left-hand side. The story is pretty straightforward. It failed, and it failed because Abaga Khan had to deal with numerous other issues, especially the Golden Horde, and so was only able to send Samgar, who was a general of his, with about one tumen, about 10,000 soldiers. And the thing is, they could not coordinate effectively with the Crusaders. So the Mamluks would fight the Crusaders on day one, fight the Mongols on day two, and keep shifting between the two fronts. They were never able to successfully pincer them. Never mind, of course, that the Crusaders were not in unison, and Edward barely held them together with a few peace treaties. We know that, yeah.
When you talk about Lord Edward, you're talking about Prince Edward that turned into Edward Longshanks, right?
Yes, this is Edward Longshanks, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so Edward actually was the subject of a failed assassination. You can see the drawing below where Edward kills the assassin. We don't know who paid for the assassin, whether it was Baibars, whether it was the Emir of Ramle, or whether it was from the assassins in the mountain at Masyaf. But anyway, Edward left in September of 1272, and we would see no more crusades to the Holy Land anymore. Now, the thing is that Baibars didn't just go to war with the Crusaders. He went to war with a number of other entities. So between 1272 and 1276, he went to war with Makuria. We've seen Makuria before when the Rashidun Caliphate tried to invade them. This time was more successful. Makuria became a vassal state of the Ayyubids, and Baibars also attacked the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had become a vassal state of the Mongols after being conquered, and he forged a way into there, fighting the Battle of Elbistan, which was a stunning victory against the Mongol forces defending that territory. But Baibars knew that he couldn't withstand the full might of the Mongol army when it would return, and so the invasion was more of a raid than an actual conquest. We had Kalawun, who succeeded in 1277, and Khalil, his son, who succeeded in 1290, finishing off the Crusader states of Tripoli in 1289 and Acre in 1291 after large and complex sieges. Once they took those cities, there was an incredible massacre of the remaining Crusaders there. And that was the end of the Crusader states. Now, in terms of the Mamluk economy, after that point, it became relatively settled. There would be a large number of peasants who would create revenues, taxable revenues. Those revenues would be used to buy more Mamluk soldiers from the Golden Horde, and those Mamluks would ensure peace and tranquility, more or less, throughout the Mamluk Sultanate. Since after the Ninth Crusade, there were no longer attempts to retake the east, from the Mediterranean coastline, the Mamluks were relatively safe. Additionally, the Mamluks began to trade with India, and this became a steady source of revenue because they began to permit the Venetians and the Genoese to trade with them as they had traded with the Crusader states. They began to trade with them in Alexandria, and so they were also able to make money on the spice trade as well. So just to finish it up with a few questions, why do you think that we don't see any more crusades to the east?
I would suggest cost a great deal of money plus lack of success. And there's nobody there actually for them to, like when they first arrive, they have no allies there.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. Any other ideas? One of the interesting things is that Louis IX had a lot of difficulty recruiting for his two crusades because a lot of Frenchmen would rather have fought in the Albigensian Crusade, right? Because it's right at home. They don't have to go anywhere. And starting in the 1300s, we have a lot of crusades inside of Europe, especially against the nascent, what we could call retroactively Protestant movements. But of course, they wouldn't be Protestant until the 16th century.
They'd be Hussite. You've got the 100 Years' War going on in France,
Absolutely.
which would be important. I've read Terry Jones's book on the Chaucer's Knight, and he's arguing there that quite a few Christian writers question the morality of the Crusades.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There was a huge question about whether the Crusades were legitimate. And on the flip side, during the 1300s, you also had a lot of people writing poetry of how wonderful it would be to crusade, but far be it from them to grab a horse and go. And the other question, which is, of course, is probably the most important question in our modern day, right? Were the Crusades imperialist, colonialist? Were they something else? How would you contextualize the Crusades now that we've spent about 6 hours talking about them and what they led to?
I would suggest initially the first crusade was something like colonialist. They did intend to settle, but after that, it seems like land piracy. It's just going over there to plunder, get as much as they can, and they don't intend to stay.
But you've got a bunch of warrior cultures, and warrior cultures go to war. I'm sitting here with my band of warriors, and I damn, Rich has too many cattle. If it turns out somebody's religious beliefs are wrong, that's a perfect reason to do it.
Yeah, I think
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think I agree with those. It's a bit of everything. There was no one purpose. I mean, there was no one controlling agent, particularly if you're taking all of the Crusades. A whole bunch of different people went for different purposes. But I would certainly agree with Joe that there was the idea of settling. I mean, people like some of the leaders of it actually sold their land in Europe and moved there, and they became the king of it. There was Baldwin, the king of Edessa, who became the king of Jerusalem. They intended to settle there and take it over and colonize it. And then there was just a fair bit of imperialist conquest as well. So, and then there was just the religious aspect of it and wanting to receive redemptions of sins and eternal life. So there were a whole bunch of different motives. Thanks.
Interesting point. The Normans took northern France, and then they took Sicily. Middle East makes sense as the next place to attack.
No, absolutely. No, I think one of the things that we sort of miss in our modern analysis, and I think what you guys said is absolutely right, that there was a sort of settler colonial element, that the later Crusades were more stylized on raids and sacks than on actual conquests. But in a certain way, the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the County of Tripoli and the County of Edessa and the Principality of Antioch, all of these states were independent states that were self-governing to a degree, that had their own needs and intuitions, right? We talked about how during the Second Crusade that the European leaders that came had absolutely no understanding of the geopolitics. And so they attacked the one Muslim ally that the Crusader states had. So I think that there's also something that becomes indigenous to a certain extent, that they become part of the region. And it's not just imperial projection of, let's say, France, or imperial projection of, let's say, the Holy Roman Empire.
Richard, let me ask you this. The first crusade of first couple crusades big motivation was to get rid of dangerous younger generation of which didn't have any inheritance and direct their efforts to this Holy Land. What was the demographic situation in Europe at the end of 1300s or actual 1200s?
Well,
Was it the same or it changed?
at the end of the 1200s, it was actually quite similar. The demographic situation of Europe undergoes a fundamental shift when the Black Death shows up, but that's in the 1300s.
It's later, right?
Well, they were always trying to get when the 100 Years War kicked in. There were free companies rampaging all over France, shipping those guys off to the Holy Land to be slaughtered by Muslims was a win-win proposition.
When did the Children Crusade happen? What was it right after?
When did the Witch Crusade?
Children Crusade.
The Children's Crusade, I don't remember the exact dates, but it happened towards the end.
Yeah, that's when they sold all by Genovese navy.
Yeah.
It's interesting on the Mamluks. Actually, the catalyst for Mamluks becoming legit was the Saladin. He taxed the land, he gave them the land, he made them nobles. That was an interesting aspect of it, and that's how they rose through the ranks. Before they probably hadn't had any opportunity, so that was interesting.
Yeah, no. Saladin's acquisition of legitimacy was to ask the Abbasids to grant him legitimacy, which they did. It was the Mamluks that had a much harder go of trying to get legitimacy because they were taking power from a Sunni government to a new Sunni government, as opposed to a Shiite government to a Sunni government. But by bringing the Abbasid Caliph to Cairo after the destruction of Baghdad, they got that legitimacy. But it wasn't a legitimacy that was seen by the entire Islamic world, which was why, for example, the Hafsids had also declared a caliphate, and they didn't withdraw their declaration of a caliphate when the Mamluks declared it. And the Mamluks had recognition and legitimacy issues throughout their rule. It's just that they secured it better than they otherwise could have by bringing the caliph to Cairo. I have a note actually in the comments, which I think is really cool. One of the issues of primogeniture is that only the eldest son would inherit land in Europe, and so bringing wealth. Sorry, so if you were not the firstborn child and you wanted land, the Crusades were sort of an opportunity for you to do that, in much the way that the American West was settled, or the Australian West.
That was tricky, though. There's actually a really crazy exception to that. William the Conqueror had 3 sons. He had Robert, William, and Henry. Robert went on crusade, and when William the Conqueror died, his son William II took control and took power. Robert was headed back at the end of the Crusades. William was killed by an arrow while hunting, and Henry was there, and Henry went racing back to Winchester or whatever and got himself crowned. So when oldest brother Robert got back to France, he was able to control Normandy, but eventually Henry captured him and locked him up. So in that case, the eldest son went in the crusade and missed out on being king.
Yeah.
Question. So all this knight orders, right? Templars and stuff, they're not allowed to marry. What the hell did they do to procreate?
No, they're allowed to marry. It's only priests that aren't allowed to marry. Soldiers are allowed.
No, I think the Knights Templars weren't allowed to marry. No, they had to recruit new knights. They were warrior monks.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not allowed to marry yet.
They had to recruit replacements.
Oh, they did. But how
Yeah,
did I mean, what was in the end? Or
probably that's another good way to get rid of a second son. Instead of being a wussy monk sitting around in a robe praying all day, you get to clobber people with a sword.
But you were going to say, how did they recruit? They went to localities. I mean, they were relatively well-known brands.
Yeah, I mean, they have their own banks, right? Templar banks and all that stuff.
Yeah.
It was interesting.
The only reason the Templars don't exist today is because there were issues that they had in France, and so the French king destroyed them. But that was an intentional thing.
Well, there's an interesting aspect. In Austria, they still have an embassy. That's not an embassy. It's like a small Templar bank. I don't know, and it was recently I read about it. It's more like a symbolism than anything. And
Yeah.
then Masons, they're saying that there's a connection to that.
The Masons that I've talked to make the argument that the Swiss Guard is somehow connected with the old Templar order, and the Swiss Guard is somehow connected with Masonry. That's the argument they make.
Right.
Okay, so
That sounds
one
really
irony I'd like to point out, and then Richard, you could help me with this. So to this day, the Crusades have a bad name. It's just like, I remember G.W. Bush talking about his crusade, and that got him into all sorts of trouble. But during the time of the Crusades, the Muslims are doing the same thing. They just don't call it a crusade. They're going into Spain, they're going into Persia, they're doing the exact same thing, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I would say that the reason the Crusades have the negativity associated with them that they do is because of the imperialism of the 19th century. And a lot of people make the argument that the Crusades was the first round of that. And this is obviously a contentious subject. My view is that they're not. And that the motivations for the Crusades are not the motivations of 19th century colonialism. There are some similarities, sure. There was the taking of territory by people of European descent and the creation of some sort of wealth extraction mechanism, sure. But the primary goal of 19th century colonialism was the acquisition of territory and the acquisition of wealth. It was not the acquisition of the land, for want of a better term, right? And when it's acquisition of territory, it's for the strategic value. But they don't care about the actual land or the people that they're dealing with. The Crusaders actually want to build a state. If anything, the crusading situation is more similar to modern day Israel than it is to the imperialism of the 19th century, in that you do have settlers coming from a foreign place to another place that they acquired through war. But they're not responsible to a foreign government. They're not responsible to those external entities. They are themselves, and they consider themselves to have a right to live there. So it's more like that. It's not on all fours, but I would say it strikes me as being closer to Israel than the colonial states of the 19th century.
There's a problem with I've got a copy of Lord Woodhull's Universal History. I've got the 1835 edition, but it was probably written about 1800. And Lord Woodhull describes the Crusades as a barbarian invasion of an advanced culture. He's actually quite clear about that.
Yeah.
The problem here is the Crusades do get good press from the Romantic writers from the early 19th century.
Right.
The Crusaders were noble Christians saving Jerusalem from evil pagans and heathens and stuff like that.
Right. No,
And that's why George Bush described the war in Iraq as a crusade. There should have been somebody with a wet, moldy dish mop to stuff in his mouth when he used the word crusade, because of course in the Arab world, crusaders are bad.
Yeah. I think the connection made by Romantic writers because of the religious zeal of 19th century colonialists and their idea that they would convert the savages to the proper faith.
It could be, but it's melodramatic. It's melodramatic literature, and the Crusaders are the good guys.
Right. But I don't think that.
Yeah.
Right. I think when George Bush was using it, I don't think he was referring. I don't think in his mind he was referring to the Crusades of 1,000 years ago. I think he was referring to crusade as we use it idiomatically, right? We're going to do a crusade against homelessness. We're going to do a crusade against bigotry, right? Like I think he was using crusade in that sense, and he doesn't realize that term in Arabic actually and in the Muslim world generally actually means something specific that has to do with invasion and conquest.
So did the priesthood ever modify the bulls to call for crusades, or they're just basically imaginary things? I think he probably took some scripture off and said, we have to go to Jerusalem. I don't know what was.
No, the popes issued bulls in defense of crusading, right? Today we talked about Quia Maior. There were bulls that were issued but in 1096, why is the name escaping me? Who was the Pope in 1096? Pope Urban II, when he gave his speech, to invigorate and start the crusade. All these things were said. Pope Urban II also had to create just war. I mean, he didn't create it out of nothing. It already existed, but he really developed just war theory, because because Catholicism and Christianity more generally has a difficulty that a lot of other religions don't have, which is that the founder of the religion was a peacenik. So it's very hard. There are some lines where Jesus says take up the sword, but there's a lot more of do not resist, do not fight them, walk in the path of the Lord, and all these kinds of things. So starting with St. Augustine, Christians have had to come up with just war theory, like under what conditions is it permissible to go to war, and the repression of Christians and the inability to make pilgrimage were considered legitimate casus belli.
Interesting.
I'm just looking at Wikipedia here. The popes moved from Rome to Avignon, France in 1309. And then a pope moved back to Rome, and somebody else in Avignon declared he was the pope. And there were two popes from about 1377 on until well into the 15th century. So the popes had something much nastier than Muslims running around.
Yes, but
i.e. another pope.
Yeah.
And I think there was a third pope for a little while.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy.
All right. So I just want to sort of give a sense of where we're going to go. So our next two meetings are going to move us from Egypt and the Levant, where we've been spending 3 consecutive lessons, and we're going to go to Persia. We're going to see what Persia looks like at the same time as the Crusades. So these last 3 sessions on the Crusades will be the next 2 sessions on the Persian side. One of them, of course, being the Great Seljuk Empire and the Khwarezmians, who succeed them. And then the second session will be the Mongols, who conquer all of those empires and basically conquer most of the Middle East, right? We're going to talk about them. Then the next thing we're going to do after that is talk about, and then after that we're going to talk about the Ilkhanate, which is the state that's formed at the end of this time period. And after the Ilkhanate, we'll slowly move towards Anatolia, right? We'll get there in mid-November. So that's where we're going and what we've seen. I'm really happy that you guys have stayed along so far, and I hope you keep coming.
Richard, thank you. I just wanted to remind that Narul had kind of joined the party, but his days are on Wednesdays, so you have still Tuesdays. You're solely dedicated to you, Rich. So Narul is going to do Islam 101, Sharia law, and he's going to do the women in Islam. And then
and that's tomorrow?
No, starting November. Sorry.
Okay.
November on Wednesdays. Yeah, I worked it out that way. All right. See you guys next week or this week when join us, and have a nice rest of the week. Thank you, Richard. Great job.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Zach.
Okay, thanks, Richard.
Night, everybody.
Richard.
Great,
Thank
great
you.
presentation.
Yep.
All right. See you.